Welcome to the Business Performance Podcast, where we feature expert thought leaders and cover their best strategies, stories, and advice that you can use to successfully mature your own business performance. Now, here is your host, business coach, Henry Schneider. Hello, everyone. This is Henry Schneider with the Business Performance Podcast, and today it's my pleasure to speak with Lisa Wardlaw, who is basically now consulting with startups and helping people understand insurance. She's got a long, varied career in digital strategy and transformation. So, Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Henry.
Sure. Okay, so could you please put things in context, kind of give us a background, the companies you've worked with, the types of customers you're interacting with, and what type of services you're actually providing at this point?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I've spent most of my career being entrepreneurial within big blue chip Fortune 100 companies, about a decade of consulting with PwC. I've also worked for large brand names such as ING, which is now Voya, the Home Depot, Munich Re. But the essence of my career has been focused on how to approach things in a pragmatic, insightful, and entrepreneurial way so that we can actually buck the tide and kind of achieve operational excellence and in looking at things from different perspectives.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I always ask everybody about quality. Quality is a big, broad term, and from an operational excellence perspective, how do you define quality?
How would I define quality? So I think quality. My roots are being an auditor, so quality is loosely defined, in my opinion, as ensuring that the transactions you ingest at the very beginning of the value chain are accurately reflected and seamlessly processed all the way at the end of the value chain. And I would add to that, especially in our digital data analytics focused world, that you have as much data readily available from ideally a similar or credible source in which you don't get different answers when you look at the data from different places.
Very good. I like your definition. Other people keep talking, well, it's what the customer wants, and that's another way to look at it, but that feels so loosey-goosey to me. Okay, so when you talk to people, what do you see or hear as one of the couple of biggest myths or misconceptions out there when it comes to quality or business performance?
I would say that I think it kind of sits on two sides. I think on one side, people think, well, all transformation is just about, in essence, cost savings. And then the other big misconception is we're going to apply all this kind of heavy hitting technology and we're going to eliminate, thousands of jobs and all these hours because we won't need that anymore when the technology revolution comes. And so I think a couple misconceptions there. The first one is you have to understand the ROI of what you're trying to transform and your technology itself. A lot of times, in my opinion, the technology clearly can help. I'll call it some of the rote things people do. Don't get me wrong, like typing should be something we go after. But I think there's this middle layer that technology is not always your most efficient answer. And a lot of technology is misconceived to be kind of down here in these layers. And where we really should be applying technology is to help in that subjective layer, one layer higher, and how we can enable that to be much faster, much quicker, et cetera. So I think about it like maintaining rules engines. I think about it as decision matrices. How do we enable someone to get to the cognitive subjective part of what they do, as opposed to just getting it in a format that makes that rule kind of come to their workstation to begin with.
Yeah, and the other part too, what you were saying is that, it's people's jobs. There you go. The goal here is not to eliminate the human being. The goal is to automate the mundane, error-prone stuff to free people up to be creative and be more productive in what they do, use their brain.
Exactly. And, I read a great book that was written by Scott Hartley called The Fuzzies and the Techies, Why the Fuzzies will Rule the Digital World, which just seems almost kind of uncharacteristic to most people. Scott Hartley wrote it. It's a fabulous book. But I think what people maybe, the misconception is we forget that as just a core part of humanity with the psychology and sociology. We've actually kind of been consuming so much of our day with mundane that we kind of forget how much there is there in terms of the subjective, which if you talk to a lot of HR colleagues and CEOs, one of the big things that everyone is focused on is employee engagement. Like, why aren't employees engaged? Well, one of the number one reasons why employees aren't engaged is they consume themselves and are so saturated with a high portion of mundane work. The analytical, subjective part of the work, however, is actually predominantly what they're paid for, and they get to spend so little time in that vortex of where engaged, that I think what we're all aiming for as into that subjective cognitive vortex.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I mean, just think about all the email you get every day in the office. I mean, if somehow you could automatically, I mean, you do have rules you can set up, but that's a pain. But if you could somehow have it where it could filter out all those little messages that come out and say, oh, this has been updated, that you don't care about, and you could focus it onto the more important things, it'd be great.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, because one of the initiative, I think, like kind of to your point about misconceptions and initiatives, one of the initiatives I was targeting was it's most people just focus on improving the process, the operational business process, but we often forget about it's equally important to enhance every aspect of our employees' daily lives. So to your point, like, if you're a digital tech company or you're digital first and your employees are like, oh, we got to log into this system and we have to log into that system and our emails. And, why don't we all have Alexa at the office that we can just say, hey, Alexa, I need this. And it can go to Outlook and make that happen. And by the way, that is coming. There's cognitive AI companies that do that. Yeah. Or I not only want to know how much vacation I have left, this is clearly before COVID, I want to book a trip. Tell me what's the least dollar time a year and match it to my kid's school calendar so I can figure out where I want to go in the world at what time. I think that as we transform, we also have to really enrich our employees' lives in that very psychological way, because it can't just be about rote automation. It also has to be about fulfillment and if you will, orchestration. And those are the things that I think people overlook when they're striving just for KPIs or just for operational lean.
Yeah, and the trouble here, in my opinion, with KPIs is people are focusing on probably the wrong measures to begin with, and because they don't relate to anything, there's one of my pet peeves is correlation versus causation. There's a lot of correlation out there, but it doesn't mean that there's any cause and effect relationship between those things. And it doesn't matter what you do with those KPIs. If you cannot directly tie it back to an event that caused it to happen, you're not going to be able to affect anything.
Exactly. Which is, clearly we have seen a shift from what I would say is data mining focus to process mining focus. And there's a lot of tools and techniques out there that can sit on top of your processes and kind of automatically process map them and process mine them. But to your point, taking that further is we've all been kind of trained on, I'll call it a baseline acumen of KPIs, but we forgot to ask the question of why, what are we after, what's our business? A lot of times I'll ask somebody a simple question, well, how was the business priced? Before you ask me to operationalize it and take money out and reduce my operational overhead by, 30 or 40%, what pricing assumptions did you use in the business to the 101-isms of margin? And a lot of times I will interestingly tell you that very few people understood the overhead load. I'll call operations maybe the overhead load just for simplification. Yeah. It is just get leaner, get more efficient, get faster. But when you connect it back to the pricing, I'm like, well, show me how it's competitively advantageous or disadvantageous. And then clearly I'm trying to match the risk to the process decisions you're taking in terms of efficiency, speed, optimization. But very rarely necessarily do the pricing people know enough about operations to understand the answer to that question. They probably just used a plug load factor or something like that. So to your point, you've got to actually, and this is, you know, where you get into business strategy, you've got to understand the entire value chain, not only for yourself, but the market, your consumers, what are they willing to pay, and most importantly, your competitors, which will look vastly different in a digital economy because your competitors can come in overnight in a way that you weren't maybe anticipating in your original margin cost of operating models.
Yeah. Yeah, and just kind of a little funny story, personal experience in terms of that. Many years ago, I worked for a company where they were flowing the goals and objectives down. And they got down to our division, said, improve ROI. And you know what they did to improve the ROI? Was cut out the donuts at the meetings, cut out donuts and coffee. Because we were spending a lot of money on donuts and coffee. All I did was make everybody.
All donuts. That's funny.
Okay, so what's the biggest challenge that you see that with business and performance trying to improve it?
You know, I think it's multifaceted, right? I think it is a combination of your existing, you know, a lot of people need to be told specifically what to do and how to do it. And that's how they've been trained. So they not, you know, people say it's change management, change culture, but it's also, okay, if we move to something new, I need to prescriptively understand what it is I'm doing. And so you need the innovators to think without the prescription. And then you need the process modelers to figure out the new process, but you have to engage the people that actually understand what it is they're doing. So almost within 3 layers, and it's very hard for people to cross-sect and go between all that, never mind your layer on the technology. And the technology may not have earnestly been chosen for the business problem at hand. A lot of technology is chosen because of strategic partnerships, relationships, contract management, and then you've got this wave of, I like to call it APIs or appisms, of all this new tech coming out that's doing complex things that nobody is even aware of what they're doing. And so how do you as a leader put all that together? So I think that can be overwhelming to leaders, and so it can be easier to just say, well, I'm going to focus very simply on this thing without maybe seeing all of the different options. It would be like recording an end to a movie. What are all the different scenes and scenarios? And it's different when you're doing a movie because there's script writers that give you different options. When you're in the leadership role of operational process improvement, a lot of times you're left out of innovation. You're probably not necessarily in with the CIO and the architects. And so you're very much saying, well, how do I pay for what you need to do? And you know, you can feel isolated. So I think it's really embracing yourself in that innovator role, you know, which is what I did when I was chief operating officer. You have to embrace yourself in the innovation role and say, I'm innovating every day, but then make sure you're kind of coming down to those prescribed processes and procedures as a result of your transformation and or innovation, whatever word you want to label it.
Okay, so let's explore that a little bit here. When you were in that innovation role, how did you operate? Did you have an innovation team that you had that was just focused on R&D, or how did that work for you?
Yeah, so I was doing operational innovation, which was different than our I'll call it the think tanks or innovation labs. And so what we were doing, so I had what I called a transformation team. And these were people who came from a cross-sect of backgrounds that had nothing to do with the industry of the company that I was working for. So the goal there was different cognitive thinking and people who had a high change barometer. They didn't saturate easily with too much change. So what we were trying to do was put somebody that like understood blockchain, that understood AI, that understood process modeling, you know, that understood, I don't know, XYZ. I was looking for a lot of data processors, people who did data at totally different industries. And so we came together as a cognitive group with no hierarchy, which was interesting because that was sometimes complicated in a big bureaucratic company. Like, what? You don't have hierarchy?
Mm.
We don't really, we all work as a team. And so the kind of objective of that team was to come up with new ideas that wouldn't come out of someone who had been born and bred in that industry. Kind of get rid of we've always done it this way. Mm-hmm. But then we had a stakeholder group, you can call it your key success factor. And I was actually just talking to a woman that does an AI industrial psychology platform. We could run this on our employees and understand who was more receptive to, even though they were process owners, to thinking outside the box. So they had a little bit of a marker. And so we bring them in and say, okay, now layer in, how would we do this given kind of the key risk of this process, okay? Then we'd have to bring in another layer to say, how do we make that process really distinct, repeatable, documented, and understood? So it's a multi-layer process. You can't just go in at an innovation level. You can't just go in at a grassroots level. And clearly it takes tone at the top. So you have to, eat your own dog food.
Yeah.
You have to own it. You have to be willing to make decisions, with your own home.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, what you're bringing out some very interesting points. When you look at all the different quality movements, go all the way back to Duran and Deming, they were promoting all this stuff. But we tried quality circles, TQMS, ISO 9000. They're all isolated, and even Six Sigma is like focused on fix this one problem here and forget about everything else around it, but just focus it on that. And you need to really come with a holistic approach and come from different perspectives. And really, and like you say, think outside the box.
Right.
Okay, all right. So now, could you share a story here where you helped the client or somebody to overcome these obstacles and be successful?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess there's so many things that maybe come back in my mind, but I think I'll use one that's kind of just maybe relevant to people regardless of what industry you're in. And I think of it as how do you match transactions, which sounds funny because you would think, well, system A and system B, matching transactions shouldn't be like this big, huge, complex or, awesome success story. But we had, over 80 people matching different transactions. And predominantly we had a unique situation where we didn't have a point of sale system because that wasn't our business model. So we would get the cash transactions without something to tag it to, just in a very simple way. And so we leveraged actually a technique that I knew about from my accounting days, which is called transaction match. So we leveraged that technique, but the foresight there is, you're squeezing the balloon from one to the other, because what you're doing is you're going from people and doing all this manually to really complex business roles. So then you've got to set up the exception to the rule and the exception and the exception to the rule. And why does it work this way and not that way? Which what you really do is you take all those people that were doing the matching and then you move them to business rule management 101. I would say that the good news for us is we saw that coming. So if you're doing this, see that coming. It will come. And a lot of times those people may not be comfortable with managing business rules because depending on the software you use, it could be a little bit more technical, although I think everyone could be upskilled to manage that. But the other thing too is this is a great time, kind of to what we were talking about at the beginning, to apply those heavy hitting techniques. So now we're not talking about data entry. Now we're talking about how do you apply something like, for example, machine learning? How do you apply that to actually maybe recommend match roles? How do you apply that to see, I've studied enough of your matches over time that this is a typical match that you typically do, or I can see the exception because 9 times out of 10, this company with this transaction is going to be an exception, and I can see how you handle that. So I'm going to go ahead and suggest that to you so that you can, within a certain confidence interval, start accepting those. So that was, to me, a great success story. And I guess I'll go a little bit further that we did not actually design that technology. We understood that technology was not proprietary to our business. We had a very strong philosophy of no code, nothing custom. And we were able to convince our technology partner as part of our ecosystem to invest in their R&D to help further the capabilities of an existing product line. Now, the way we had to convince them of that is to demonstrate it that it's applicable to multiple industries, not just our industry and not just this one business scenario, which is where that more cognitive conceptual team can help, because what we had to do was basically do like a business case pitch to that provider to tap into their R&D for this business purpose.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you could take that story now and distill it down to 25 words or less, what would be the moral?
The moral of the story is understand your tech, what's proprietary to your business process and what's not. Understand the R&D of your partners and be compelling with your business case to be able to get the business solution you need out of your technology partners.
Okay. All right, wonderful. Now, let's kind of tie it back into about the machine learning aspect. So basically what you have is a bunch of subject matter experts that you're trying to get inside their head and pull all this stuff out. So there's probably some fears associated with that, or being afraid of losing their job. So how'd you get over that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first part is a lot of times let's step outside the fear of job loss for a moment, and let's just go into the asking someone what the business rules are. It would almost be like asking you how to get to your neighborhood restaurant. You would say, well, I don't know, at the yellow blah blah blah, I take a left, and then when I see this tree I take a right. I mean, you wouldn't probably necessarily go into a Google Maps analytical at this street I veer, because we all are we operate on a sense of known and kind of familiarity, right? So a lot of business rules are based on a sense of familiarity. It's less prescriptive and more, well, this is what I do. So I would say that before we would even get to the fear of job loss or anything like that, I think that it was just, how do you extract familiarity? It's easy to extract, I'll call it very rigid logic. We probably would have had the business rules already done, quite honestly, even coded, if it was just a matter of logic. So how do you extract familiarity? So that's step one. You have to crack that. How do you extract familiarity? And then make it repeatable. Because then somebody beside you will say, well, that was familiar to Lisa, but to Kevin, it was this way, right? But we ultimately ended up at the same destination, right? Which is the same way you would drive. So parenthetically, we actually use people who were used to working on things like maps and Waze and stuff like that. We leverage some of those concepts. In terms of the fear and the job loss, I think it goes back into reassuring your employees, honestly, there's so much engagement in the subjective and less in the rote. So what we're trying to do is get it to a point where maybe you spent 20 hours of your week just getting to where you got to the subjective. What we want you to do is spend 40 hours a week in the subjective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you bring up some interesting points too. I mean, because basically it's just process mapping. You're trying to lay things out. And if people have been just doing it all up here, it's never been written down. And when you start mapping it out, you're going to try to go all different ways. You got to really focus on what's the straight path through, the thing you do all the time. And then you can start adding in the exceptions. And then you find out where it's broken.
Yeah, and I, we didn't quite take it there yet, but one other thing to think about, kind of to your point, and one thing that we've never really done a great job of with process mapping, it's always very linear and very like, let's get business process modeling tools out, or let's connect it to our data and reverse engineer it. But one thought I had, just thinking of maps and Waze, the way people vote on different things, and they show you, well, there's congestion here, or there's this here. Having your employees get into almost like a consensus-based model within your processes, so that they can kind of vote, and you can see these little bubbles come up in the process map. That's a great way to connect into that subjectivity, and I'll call it that experience acumen. And then you build almost an experience library of modeling exceptions without coding the rules. So think about it kind of similarly to kind of voting on traffic and things like that.
Yeah, plus you also get the buy-in from people too. So, okay, So now you've had a very long and interesting career. So could you just talk about how you went from accounting to get into digital transformation, and where did the light bulbs come on and say, that's what I want to do?
Yeah, what is destiny is the choices you make or what's done to you? I don't know. No, I think honestly, I didn't go at it with a specific, this is what I want to do. My mom was a dancer, my dad was an engineer, and I just happened to be one of those people that ended up in a very linear job, but had a huge non-linear DNA marker. And I was fortunate because I started my career with just kind of these forefront leaders in technology that were, it was technology auditing, but that's where I started. And so I had this passion for, you don't understand anything unless you understand how, I always call it how the water flows through the system, which is the process. How does the water flow through the pipes? And that, led me to a lot of success in my auditing career. And then later on, when I joined companies, that was how I used to solve problems. Like, let me understand how the water flows. I always went back to that. That was for transformation as a buzzword. But every company, since I've been working, is always after fixing problems and making things better. I have a penchant desire to make things, to quote Marie Kondo, spark joy. Processes should spark joy. They should feel orchestrated. They should feel intentional. And they should feel like a beautiful ballet is being performed. You should bow at the end and be like, wow, that was a beautiful experience. And I literally do mean beautiful, curated. And so anytime something is not curated, or you shake your head going, like, why was this hard? I was always trying to fix it. I was always trying to understand why it was hard. Why are we shaking our heads? Why is this so difficult to get the data? Why can't we answer the CEO and CFO's question? I spent a lot of time in finance. But mostly because why was it so hard on the people being asked the question to get to the data or the answer? So then I ended up kind of going from that slant and saying, well, I really want to understand why operations is not as beautiful and not as curated as I would want to see it. And in doing that, I decided, well, if you want to criticize it and if you want to understand it, you better run it. Because at the end of the day, you have to be accountable for what you're willing or desiring to change. I didn't want to sit on the sidelines and coach. I wanted to actually eat my own dog food. If it went wrong, I wanted to be the one to be accountable. Because I think that as a leader, it just gives you a totally different amount of vision and inspiring your team when you're ultimately going to be their safety net and you also have a stake in what you're asking them to do. Mm-hmm. So that led me into operations. And as part of that, I really got this just depth of technology and the integration of technology and how do we go digital first? What does it mean to be digital first? What does it mean to, I'll call it lip service, becoming digital when you're window dressing and you've got all this custom code on the side. So really learning that technology, I just became kind of unequivocally passionate for how do you do it in an authentic way that delivers a curated experience to your business.
Okay. All right, thank you. Now, kind of in a similar vein, just thinking about growing up, do you have an experience that happened to you in your life that affects how you approach business today?
Well, experience in my life. I mean, I would say it's probably just a combination. So clearly, as a dancer, I think that, people always think of, I think the arts as being very maybe fluid and very loose and, like maybe not structured at all. And I probably honestly never learned more about never quit. I mean, I've danced with a broken leg before. Wow. Until the curtain goes down, you don't quit. I also learned, I wish my mom were alive to tell her this. I learned how to take a vision and bring it to reality. Because at the end of the day, that's predominantly what dancing is you're trying to inspire a moment. You're trying to take somebody into another world and into a vision. And you cannot let them see how complex it is and how much you sweated and just, I am amazed at like prima ballerinas, how hard you work to get there. Because at the end of the day, dance is grace and it's effortless. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, honestly, I never knew it at the time, but I think that upbringing and that understanding how you can bring vision and how you can make what's seemingly impossible possible in a very orchestrated way. I would have to say that's what fueled me in later in my career.
Wonderful. Okay, that's really good. All right, so now let's kind of step back and talk about Lisa Wardlaw. What does success look like for Lisa Wardlaw?
I think that success in general is defined as truly finding a way to crack the nut of making things easy, on making things process in a way that brings the user, whether it's the customer, the operational processor, the end of the value chain. Can't leave my finance people out of this. An experience that they don't leave shaking their head and saying, why is it like this? That is success to me. If we can have that, almost like Disney says, they make magic happen every day. If we can invigorate our processes to the way that it's not only delivering the speed and pace and operational margin that we deem justifiable, but if we layer on top of this experience in which you don't have any touch point in that experience that makes you shake your head and say, why is this not working? Why is it so hard? That to me defines success.
Okay, thank you. Now let's kind of shift gears and talk about COVID-19. So right now, since business has been really disrupted at this point, this is kind of like the optimal time to push ahead with innovative and transformative type projects. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So I've actually been having quite a few discussions with people about that. And you kind of see, in essence, and sadly what I would expect to see, which is people are either doubling down and they're like the turtles going into the shell, they're withdrawing and they're saying like, no money, no new, we just got to survive. We've got to triage and get through, the end of the day. And then in doing that, you see what I call the mundaneism. So they're having this opportunity to become digital first, and that experience they're having with the customer, they're just deeming it satisfactory. It's satisfactory for me to, for example, get groceries to your front door, because you should be happy that you don't have to go out to the grocery store, and by the way, I'm deeply grateful to all the people delivering and shopping for my groceries. But a extension of that, what I would like to see people doing right now is, how do we use all the data and the data analytics and the process transformation that we should have had to actually pre-support what you would want? Like, for example, I ordered something the other day and they sent me something that I've never, ever ordered in my life. And it was probably just a typo. They should have been proactively able to say, oh, are you sure? Because you've never ordered this, never in your whole history of using this. And so I think that a lot of companies are doing great, but they maybe have a false sense of comfort that people are happy and pleased with that digital experience. And I don't see right now that enough people are going to turn their customers digital forever. I think people will go back, and if anything, they may regress a little bit because they didn't make that moment unexpected and, if you will, I call it avoid the shake the head. It could be easier than this. So I think that the caution that we all have to face is, clearly you've got to do what you can do. Clearly you got to dust off what's on your shelf or what's operating, and you've got to go out there and serve your customers, and you've got to triage, and you've got to get through the end of the day. But I think we need to be using this as a time to maybe spark on all cylinders, including those curated experiences, and really use COVID as the fog. Where, all digital is one step forward, two steps back. Use COVID as the fog when you're taking your two steps back so that you can amp your one step forward when the fog starts to burn off or lift.
Right. And the other way I look at it is that you want to provide a wow experience for your customers.
Yes.
And whatever you can do to go that extra mile and show some innovation and some, initiative, I think would go.
Exactly. It's the proactive. I would say it's proactive, unexpected, and easy. Mm-hmm. Those are the three things that I would target if I were trying to ensure I had that forever customer experience right now.
So the other thing too, I mean, the COVID-19 blindsided the world. Basically, nobody planned for contingency operations. Nobody had defined what are my essential services that cannot be interrupted no matter what. You know, some of these companies were just lucky because people were already working remotely. But I mean, we've got that now. So, you know, since we're in this situation now, how would you advise somebody what they have to do in order to restart and come back to normal and to be ready for the next time something happens?
Yeah, that's definitely that's such a multi-layered question in terms of you know, property management, physical space, you know, devices, Wi-Fi, connectivity, you know, disaster recovery, business continuity, etc. But you know, I guess what I would say is, and I think what we've learned in all this is that we do need to have a plan for the unexpected. And I think that I used to actually always say this when I would sit in these business continuity management meetings. I was the cynic in the room, and I'm like, you know what? This is kind of irrelevant because we can have all these business continuity plans all day long, but at the end of the day, everything we think, like, it's not going to be there. You know, like, I used to always joke, the first thing was use your cell phone. Well, what if the cell lines are down, like in a hurricane or, you know, 9/11 or something like that? So I guess what we should be planning for is the unexpected. So I'll start there. Then I would say what we need to understand is, how do we tap into maybe the psychology, sociology, humanity side of our workforce and our business continuity plans, maybe not just the tactical operational side, because business continuity has always been focused on the bare minimum operations to keep my lights on. Certainly not in those curated experiences, and not necessarily focused on the employee. It's really just, how do you get your work done, not how do you stay engaged in getting your work done, right? So I think that we need to probably morph a little bit more into the psychology side, and clearly there's people who are much more expertise at that than me, but understanding even things like, you know, I was thinking today, like people who want to return, or maybe companies that are, but they're still fearful, and making sure we don't feel judged. If your children are like in the background, how that's no longer deemed unprofessional. There's just all this depth that we've never had to experience before as professionals, that I think leaders are going to have to stand and give people, again, back to what we were talking about earlier. You go from that, what is your innovative vision, into kind of like, how would I make it work from a process perspective? But then you actually have to make it maybe more defined and concrete for people to understand, like, this is acceptable, maybe this isn't. How does that affect a salaried employee versus an hourly employee? So I'll leave it at that. But I think that we'll see a lot of, you know, sadly, I think we'll, a lot of what happens if there's a pandemic, just kind of like we saw like post 9/11 and like we've seen post hurricanes, but maybe not as much of those. What if the next thing is something we didn't plan for? And that's what I think people need to be focused on. We clearly never thought 5 years ago this is where we would be today. So how can we plan for the unexpected? Because that's hard. There's really no plan for the unexpected, other than to be prepared for it, right?
Right. You don't know what you don't know. And that's the thing. But you have to, you know, to make doing something's better than doing nothing at all.
Exactly.
I had a client that I looked at their business continuity plan, and and this is a couple of years ago. Their plan was to set up shop in another country, and I'm figuring, you know, if you have to do that, you're not going to be back in business because you're at war. You know, it's like it's the end of Armageddon has occurred if you have to move your operations to another country. So yeah, I mean, but you know, this is the thing. Is like there's going to be some other things that it's going to shut down. Maybe not globally, but you'll have regional areas where operations are gone for a period of time. Okay,
Right.
so the other thing that companies have noticed too is that there's an increased communication with everybody because now everybody's isolated, so they're touching base more frequently. And executives are seeing that as a good thing. They haven't talked to their employees as much as they've had in the past. And I wonder is, you know, what can they do to make that continue on going in that direction? Once we return back to normal, quote unquote, normal operations, bring people back into the home office, how are they going to sustain that, what they've kind of experienced now?
Yeah, that's a great observation. I hate to say it, but I think it's going to take discipline. It's going to require carving that out, just like your health, just like your well-being, even networking and being empathetic and being more willing to take calls with people. I mean, and by the way, like, nobody does it to be disingenuous or not to make the time, right? You're traveling, you're flying, you're busy, you're working 16-hour days, you get in, your time zones are all messed up. So, your time to be with employees, maybe as a CEO, like, you're honestly lucky if you can carve out that quarterly meeting or whatever. So it's just like, all of us in our day-to-day lives. And so I think what's going to have to happen is it's going to have to be intentionally carved out as equally as important as the flight, as the business meeting, as the deal. And usually when those things are color coded in people's calendar, those are things that are optional when a fire drill comes up. So it's going to require an intentional discipline and a relative ranking on that as being equal in priority as a business deal. That's my number one takeaway on that.
Well, the other thing that's interesting too is with these, of having a video chatting with everybody, I think it tends to humanize, all the levels of management, because when you're in the office, the C-levels, they're in their mahogany row areas where it's intimidating to go in there. But now you see them in their home, working in their kitchen, somebody's walking by, dogs barking, just like everybody else. It's kind of a leveling thing.
So, I mean, I think we'll see that, because I think that I just read a great article, like work from anywhere instead of work from home, because, we're going to see a lot more nomad and people taking almost kind of like sabbaticals of, I can do this work from this position. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. And I think you're right. It will humanize people more. It does humanize people more. And then that's going to have to get into, well, what work protocols are humanizing and what are deemed, we're going to have to kind of get rid of our concept of unprofessional, which COVID thrust us into anyway. Yeah. So I think as long as we don't have to backtread too much on that and understand that, even at work, we all had that human slant. It's just like we kind of almost had to leave it as we walked into our place of business. I mean, clearly we all talked about our families and our weekend or, whatever, but there's almost like a tolerable amount of that. And so I think we're going to have to learn how to rethink that in this new workplace. And that's going to be really critical for the, you don't have to come back to the office. But we are going to still have to socially interact.
Sure. Okay. So thinking back to when you were the transformational officer, what were your top 3 concerns from a business perspective, business capability challenge perspective?
I think my number one concern was always pace. Like, how do you get this done in a litmus that's under a year? Which sounds funny because I know technology companies can get something to market in maybe 2 months. So pace was a huge concern of mine. My other concern was always, am I using the right technology for the right solution at the right time? Because I didn't want to use a technology and then change it. So what I ended up doing was forming a lot of technology suites where I could adapt out the technology, because let's be real, the technology changes as soon as you and I are having this conversation. There's probably 100 more things that can do maybe what we locked in on 3 months ago in our project plan. So I kind of ended up forming these suites of technology where the technology itself wasn't my foundation and I could kind of adapt it in and out. I used to always tell my friends, I don't want to get divorced from you in a marriage. I want to get annulled, as though it never happened. They don't really like that. They want it to be sticky. But, fiduciarily, I felt like one of my top concerns was making sure that I was fiduciary aligned to my company and less to the vendor, right? And then, I would say my third thing was making sure that we were competitively differentiated. So we all predominantly have quite a similar checkbook in terms of when we're buying technology. So that gets into that conceptual cognitive application. How are we thinking about it? and not just letting somebody tell us this is how it should be used, right? So how are we thinking about it? But again, holding to the round hole, round peg. You don't want to misappropriate or misuse technology, because then it may not scale and perform as it's designed to.
Yeah. Okay, well, great. So I'm looking at the clock and I can see we're rapidly running out of time here. So I really appreciate talking with you tonight, Lisa. So how can people get in touch with you to learn more?
Sure. So my email is lisa.wardlaw@gmail.com.
Okay, thank you. Well, Lisa, this has been a lot of fun talking with you. So I really appreciate your time and all sharing your insights. So thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Thank you, Henry. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Business Performance Podcast with your business coach, Henry Schneider. For more episodes and business strategies, please visit welcome.ppqc.net/blog. That's www.welcome.ppqc.net/blog. And remember to subscribe so you can get the latest episodes. Thank you.